Take a deep breath and let your body sink into comfort, releasing the weight of the day with each gentle exhale. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, just this peaceful moment. This soft space where you can simply rest and listen. Allow the story to wash over you like a quiet stream, carrying you gently towards sleep at your own natural pace. Today, I am going to narrate a true story of sleep sickness in the winter of 1918, as the world reeled from the devastation of the Great War and the Spanish flu pandemic. Another mysterious illness began to creep silently through the streets of Vienna, Paris, London, and New York. It arrived without warning, without explanation, and without mercy. They called it encephalitis lethargica, the sleeping sickness, and it would become one of the most haunting medical mysteries of the 20th century. Rose Mackenberg was 23 years old when the illness found her, a vibrant young woman who worked as a seamstress in the garment district of Manhattan. Rose had survived the Spanish flu that had killed millions worldwide. She had danced at jazz clubs in Harlem, dreamed of becoming a fashion designer, and was engaged to be married to a kind man named Samuel who worked at his father's bakery. Her future stretched before her like a bolt of fine silk, ready to be cut and shaped into something beautiful. It began with a headache, just a small throb behind her eyes one Tuesday morning in March of 1921. Rose ignored it, as young people often do, and went to work. By Wednesday, the headache had intensified, and a strange heaviness had settled over her limbs. By Thursday, she could barely lift her arms to thread her needle. On Friday, Rose Mackenberg fell asleep at her sewing machine and would not fully wake up for 37 years. Her story, and the stories of hundreds of thousands like her, would baffle doctors, devastate families, and eventually fade into obscurity, remembered only as a footnote in medical textbooks. But for those who lived through it, for those who watched their loved ones vanish into a living death, encephalitis lethargica was an epidemic as terrifying as any plague in history. This is the story of the sleeping sickness of the people it imprisoned, and of one woman's long journey through the twilight between waking and sleeping. The disease appeared suddenly, like a thief in the night. In Vienna, the renowned neurologist Konstantin von Economo first documented the strange, new illness in 1917. Patients would arrive at his clinic complaining of fever, headache, and profound exhaustion. Within days, they would slip into a peculiar state that resembled sleep but was something far more sinister. Some remained in this suspended state for weeks, months, or years. Others would eventually wake, but when they did, they were no longer themselves. The early symptoms were deceptively simple and easy to mistake for common ailments. A fever would climb slowly through the body, rarely exceeding 102 degrees Fahrenheit. The patient might complain of a sore throat, of aching muscles, of feeling as though they had not slept well the night before. Parents would send their children to bed early, thinking they had caught a simple cold. Workers would leave their posts and return home to rest, expecting to feel better after a good night's sleep. And then, gradually, imperceptibly, the tiredness would deepen. The eyelids would grow heavy, as though weights had been attached to them. The limbs would become leaden, difficult to lift, difficult to move. Speech would slow to a crawl, words forming like molasses dripping from a spoon on a cold winter morning. The patient would sleep for longer and longer periods, waking only briefly to eat small amounts of food before slipping back under the surface of consciousness. In the most severe cases, they would not wake at all. But this was not ordinary sleep, not the restorative slumber that refreshes the body and mind. Doctors who examined the sleeping patients found that they could sometimes be roused with great difficulty. Their eyes would flutter open, unfocused and distant, like someone looking at the world from very far away. They might answer a question with a single word before drifting away again, like a boat slipping from its mooring. Some patients remained in a state of semi-consciousness, their eyes open but unseeing, neither fully asleep nor fully awake. They existed in a grey twilight, trapped between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The disease spread slowly but steadily through the world, moving from city to city, country to country. By 1919, it had reached epidemic proportions in Europe, filling hospital beds from Vienna to London. By 1920, it had crossed the Atlantic, appearing in New York, Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco. Cases were reported from every continent, from bustling cities and remote villages alike. The medical community scrambled to understand what they were witnessing. Was it a new form of sleeping sickness, like the African trypanosomiasis transmitted by the tsetse fly? Was it related to the Spanish flu that had just ravaged the world? Was it a neurological disorder, an infection, a toxin in the environment? Konstantin von Economo performed autopsies on patients who had died from the disease, carefully examining their brain tissue under microscopes. What he found was inflammation in the brain, particularly in the substantia nigra and other deep structures that controlled movement and wakefulness. The term encephalitis lethargica was born from these findings. Encephalitis meant inflammation of the brain. Lethargica referred to the profound lethargy that characterized the illness, but naming the disease did not bring them closer to understanding its cause or finding a cure. The patients continued to sleep, continued to fade away from the world of the waking dot. Rose Mackenberg's family brought her home from the hospital after 3 weeks of fruitless treatment. The doctors could do nothing for her. There were no medications that helped, no procedures that could wake her. She lay in her childhood bedroom, in the same bed where she had slept as a little girl, her breathing slow and regular, her face peaceful as though she were enjoying a pleasant dream. Her mother sat beside her bed day after day, holding her hand, talking to her, reading to her from her favorite books. Sometimes Rose's fingers would twitch slightly. Sometimes her eyelids would flutter as though she were about to wake. These small signs gave her mother hope that perhaps tomorrow would be the day Rose would wake, that perhaps tomorrow her daughter would open her eyes and smile and ask what had happened. Samuel came to visit, every evening after closing the bakery, still wearing his white apron dusted with flour. He would sit on the other side of the bed and tell Rose about his day, about the bread he had baked that morning, about the customers who had come into the shop asking for their usual orders. He told her about the wedding they would have when she woke up, about the apartment they would rent on the Lower East Side, about the children they would raise together. He spoke to her as though she could hear every word, and perhaps, in some deep place beyond the reach of ordinary consciousness, she could. Weeks turned into months, and the months began to stretch into a year. The doctors suggested that the family prepare for the worst. They explained, as gently as they could, that patients who remained unconscious for this long rarely recovered. Even those who did wake often suffered permanent damage. They might be paralyzed on one side of their body. They might have lost their ability to speak or think clearly. They might wake only to exist in a state of profound disability, requiring constant care for the rest of their lives. But Rose's mother refused to give up hope. Every morning she awoke her daughter's body, washed her face with a warm cloth, brushed her long brown hair until it shined, and changed her nightgown. Every morning she spoke words of encouragement, of love, of unwavering faith that Rose would return to them. The medical literature from this period contains thousands of case studies, each one a small tragedy, a life interrupted. A 7-year-old boy in London who fell asleep during breakfast and did not wake for 2 years. When he finally opened his eyes, he asked his mother what was for breakfast, completely unaware that any time had passed at all. A middle-aged woman in Paris who slept for 8 months, woke briefly to ask for a glass of water, and then slept for 3 more years. A teenage girl in Boston who slept through her entire adolescence, waking at 21 to find herself in an adult body she did not recognize. Her childhood gone without her experiencing it. Some patients did not sleep at all, but instead became frozen in strange postures, like statues made of flesh. They would sit motionless for hours, sometimes for days, their bodies rigid, their faces expressionless masks. They could see and hear what was happening around them, trapped behind their own eyes. But they could not respond, could not move, could not communicate their awareness to the outside world. Doctors called this catatonia, and it was perhaps even more cruel than the sleep. To be aware but unable to act, to watch the world continue without you while you remained trapped, inside your own body like a prisoner in a cell with no doors and no windows. The disease showed no pattern in whom it chose to afflict, no mercy in its selection. Young and old, rich and poor, strong and weak, all fell victim to the sleeping sickness. Children were particularly susceptible, their developing brains perhaps more vulnerable to the inflammation. But adults in the prime of life were not spared. Some patients died within days, their brains swelling until their bodies could no longer sustain life, their hearts finally stopping after a brief struggle. Others survived the acute phase only to face long-term consequences that would haunt them for decades to come. Those who did wake from the sleeping sickness often found that the disease had left its mark upon them, had changed them in fundamental ways. They might suffer from Parkinson-like symptoms, their bodies trembling uncontrollably, their movements slow and difficult as though they were moving through water. They might experience personality changes, becoming impulsive where they had been cautious, aggressive where they had been gentle, or emotionally unstable where they had been even. Children who survived sometimes displayed behavioral problems that made it impossible for them to return to normal life, to attend school or play with other children. They would steal compulsively, lie without reason, or fly into violent rages at the smallest provocation. The medical term for these behavioral changes was moral insanity, though we would recognize it today as frontal lobe damage affecting executive function and impulse control. Families found themselves caring for loved ones who looked the same but whose fundamental nature seemed to have been altered by the disease. A gentle mother might become cruel and a studious child might become unable to focus on anything for more than a few moments. The person they had known was gone, replaced by a stranger wearing a familiar face, speaking with a familiar voice, but expressing thoughts and feelings that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. By 1926, the epidemic had largely subsided, the number of new cases dwindling month by month. New cases became rare, then vanished altogether, as mysteriously as they had appeared. The disease had come like a storm and departed just as mysteriously, leaving behind thousands of damaged survivors and no answers, no explanations, no understanding of what had happened or why. Medical researchers continued to study encephalitis lethargica for decades, searching for its cause, examining brain tissue, conducting experiments. Was it a virus? If so, which one? Why had it appeared so suddenly? Why had it disappeared? These questions remained unanswered. Mysteries that frustrated the best minds in neurology and infectious disease. In the years that followed, many survivors of the acute phase began to develop a delayed condition that physicians called post-encephalitic Parkinsonism, decades after they had seemingly recovered from the sleeping sickness. After they had returned to their lives and tried to put the illness behind them, patients found themselves gradually becoming more rigid, more slow, more frozen in their movements. It was as though the disease had planted a seed that lay dormant for years before finally sprouting, like a time bomb ticking away inside their brains. By the 1960s, many survivors from the 1920s epidemic were living in chronic care facilities, their bodies locked in positions they could not control, their minds alert but trapped inside unresponsive flesh. Rose Mackenberg slept through the roaring 20s, through one of the most dynamic decades in American history, while her friends danced to Charleston and bobbed their hair, while jazz filled the speakeasies and fortunes were made and lost on Wall Street, while flappers challenged social conventions and the nation seemed drunk on prosperity and possibility. Rose lay motionless in her childhood bed. Her mother continued her vigil, though the hope in her eyes grew dimmer with each passing year, though the lines on her face deepened with worry and exhaustion. Samuel visited less frequently as time wore on, the weeks between visits stretching into months. Eventually, he met another woman, a kind person who worked at a shop near the bakery. He came one last time to say goodbye to Rose, to apologize to the sleeping woman who had once been his fiancée, to explain that he could not wait any longer. He kissed her forehead, his tears falling on her peaceful face, and left. Rose's mother never mentioned his name again. The world changed outside Rose's window, transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible to the young woman of 1921. The economy crashed in 1929. The stock market collapsing and taking the dreams of millions with it. Breadlines formed in the streets where prosperity had once seemed endless. The Great Depression settled over America like a heavy blanket, smothering hope and opportunity. Rose's father lost his job at the factory where he had worked for 20 years. The family struggled to make ends meet, selling their furniture piece by piece, moving to cheaper and cheaper apartments, but her mother refused to send Rose to an institution, refused to give up her vigil. She would care for her daughter at home, no matter what it cost them, no matter how difficult life became. They moved to a smaller apartment in a worse neighborhood. Her mother took in laundry to earn money, her hands growing red and raw from the harsh soap and constant work. Through it all, Rose slept on, unaware of the hardships her condition was causing, unaware of her mother's devotion and sacrifice. In the hospitals and institutions where many sleeping, sickness patients resided, doctors tried various treatments, desperate to find something that would help. They administered electrical stimulation to the brain, sending currents through the skull in hopes of jarring the patients awake. They injected patients with stimulants, with sedatives, with experimental compounds that had shown promise in laboratory animals, but had never been tested on humans. Nothing worked. The patients remained frozen, unreachable, beyond the grasp of medical science and human compassion. Nurses who cared for these patients often spoke of the eerie quality of the wards where they lay. It was not like caring for ordinary unconscious patients, for people in comas from accidents or strokes. There was something present in these sleeping people, some sense that they were still there, somewhere deep inside, waiting for something that would allow them to return to the surface. The medical establishment gradually lost interest in encephalitis. as new cases ceased to appear and other concerns demanded attention. Research funding dried up, redirected to diseases that were currently active, currently killing people. The sleeping sickness became yesterday's epidemic, replaced in the public consciousness by new concerns, new diseases, new fears about polio and tuberculosis and other illnesses that seemed more pressing. The survivors were forgotten, relegated to back wards of hospitals and nursing homes, their stories untold, their suffering invisible to a world that had moved on to other crises and other concerns. World War II came, bringing new horrors and new devastation. Rose slept through the rationing, through the air raid drills, through the Gold Star banners hanging in neighborhood windows marking homes where sons would not return. Her younger brother, who had been just 15 when she fell ill, enlisted in the army and was killed at Normandy, cut down on a beach in France while his sister slept peacefully in New York. Her father died of a heart attack in 1944. The stress of the war years and the grinding poverty finally taking their toll. Her mother, now elderly and frail, her hair completely white, her back bent from years of hard work, continued to care for her sleeping daughter alone. She had devoted her entire adult life to this vigil, had given up everything else, and she would not stop now, would not abandon her daughter even though the doctors said there was no hope. The post-war years brought prosperity and change to America, a new era of abundance and optimism. Suburbs sprawled across former farmland, tract houses rising where crops had once grown. Television sets appeared in living rooms, bringing images from across the country and the world into people's homes. The baby boom generation was born, millions of children entering a world of unprecedented opportunity. Rose Mackenberg slept through all of it, her body aging slowly in its suspended state, her hair graying at the temples, her skin developing the fine lines of middle age, though she had not lived a single day of that middle age consciously, though her mind remained frozen at 20-3 in 1958. Rose's mother suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed on her left side, unable to care for her daughter any longer, unable even to care for herself. She was forced to make the decision she had resisted for 37 years, the decision she had sworn she would never make. Rose was transferred to a chronic care hospital in upstate New York, a sprawling institution that housed hundreds of patients requiring long-term care. Many of them were survivors of the sleeping sickness epidemic, men and women who had been sleeping or frozen for decades, forgotten by families who had moved on or died themselves. Rose was placed in a ward with 20 other women, all of them post-encephalitic patients, all of them trapped in various stages of the disease. Some slept as she did, their breathing slow and regular, their faces peaceful. Others sat rigid in wheelchairs, their bodies twisted into uncomfortable positions, their eyes open but distant, staring at nothing. The nurses were kind but overworked, responsible for too many patients with too few resources, unable to provide the individualized care that Rose had received from her mother. Rose received basic care. She was fed through a tube inserted into her stomach. Her body was turned regularly to prevent bed sores from forming on her skin. Her hair was combed once a week, but the devoted attention she had received from her mother, the constant talking and reading and gentle touching, was no longer possible. Rose's mother died 3 months after her daughter was transferred to the institution. She had held on as long as she could, had devoted every ounce of her strength to caring for Rose, and when that was no longer possible, she had simply let go. She died in a nursing home, calling out for her daughter, asking for Rose, wanting to be sure her daughter was being cared for properly. The news of her death was noted in Rose's medical chart, but Rose, of course, could not be told, could not grieve, could not even know that the woman who had never given up on her was gone. And then, something extraordinary happened, something that would briefly pull Rose back from the long darkness. In 1967, a young neurologist named Oliver Sacks arrived at the hospital. Dr. Sacks had heard about the mysterious population of sleeping sickness survivors who still resided in various institutions around the world, forgotten remnants of an epidemic that had ended 40 years earlier. He was fascinated by their condition and began to study them carefully, spending hours observing them, making detailed notes. What he observed troubled him deeply. These were not comatose patients. They were not brain-dead or vegetative. There was something present in them, some flicker of consciousness that conventional medical understanding could not explain or categorize. Dr. Sacks spent hours observing his patients, watching them with a patience that the overworked regular staff could not afford. He noted the way their eyes would sometimes follow movement in the room, tracking nurses or visitors as they passed by. He saw how they would occasionally respond to music or to a familiar voice, their bodies tensing slightly or their breathing changing rhythm. He watched as they seemed to exist in a state of profound slowness, as though they were living in a different temporal dimension where seconds stretched into minutes and minutes into hours, where the normal pace of life had been dramatically slowed down. They were not gone. They were not absent. They were frozen, suspended, waiting. Around this time, a new drug called L-Dopa was being tested for the treatment of Parkinson's disease with promising results. L-Dopa worked by increasing dopamine levels in the brain, helping to restore normal movement to patients whose dopamine-producing neurons had been damaged or destroyed. Dr. Sacks wondered whether this drug might also help his post-encephalitic patients. After all, many of them displayed Parkinsonian symptoms, the same tremors and rigidity and slowness of movement. Perhaps the same treatment would work for them. Perhaps this new drug could bring them back from wherever they had gone. The hospital administrators were skeptical. When Dr. Sacks proposed his experiment, these patients had been sick for 40 years or more. What were the chances that any treatment would help them now, after so much time had passed? Wouldn't it be a waste of expensive medication? But Dr. Sacks was persistent, passionate in his belief that these forgotten patients deserved a chance. And eventually he received permission to try L-Dopa on a small group of patients. Rose Mackenberg was among them, one of 20 patients selected for the trial. The drug was administered slowly at first, in small doses, gradually increasing over the course of several weeks. Dr. Sacks monitored his patients carefully, looking for any signs of response, any indication that the medication was reaching across the decades of damage to touch something still alive inside them. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Rose continued to sleep as she had for nearly 4 decades. Her breathing remained slow and regular. Her eyes stayed closed. The nurses checked on her regularly, noting her vital signs in her chart, but there was no change. No sign that the medication was having any effect. But then, on a spring morning in 1969, something changed. A nurse was checking Rose's vital signs, going through the routine she had performed hundreds of times before, when she noticed something unusual. Rose's eyelids were fluttering more than usual, moving rapidly beneath her closed lids, as though she were dreaming intensely. The nurse leaned closer and spoke to her, saying her name, and then For the first time in 37 years, Rose Mackenberg's eyes opened. She looked around the hospital room, her eyes moving slowly, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with obvious confusion. The white walls, the fluorescent lights, the medical equipment, none of it matched the bedroom she remembered. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak and rusty from decades of disuse, barely more than a whisper. The nurse rushed to find Dr. Sachs, her heart pounding with excitement and disbelief. When he arrived at Rose's bedside minutes later, she was sitting up slightly, supported by pillows, her eyes wide and bewildered, looking at him with an expression of complete confusion. Dr. Sachs introduced himself gently, speaking slowly and calmly, and explained to Rose what had happened to her. She had been sick for a very long time, he told her. She had been sleeping, but now she was awake again. Rose listened, her face registering shock and disbelief. She asked how long she had been asleep. Dr. Sachs hesitated, knowing how devastating the answer would be, then told her the truth. 37 years. Rose stared at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying. 37 years. It was impossible. It couldn't be true. Rose's first coherent words, once she could form them properly, were to ask for her mother. Dr. Sachs had to deliver the painful news that her mother had passed away 4 years earlier, had died still faithfully visiting her sleeping daughter every week until her stroke had made it impossible. Rose wept then, tears streaming down her face for a woman she had last seen when she herself was a young woman of 23 and who had died when Rose was 60, but had experienced none of those intervening years. Time had played a cruel trick on her, had stolen everything while she slept. She had lost everyone and everything, had missed decades of life, had woken up in a world she did not know in the days and weeks that followed. Rose began to emerge more fully from her long sleep, like someone swimming up from the bottom of a very deep pool. With physical therapy, she regained some use of her muscles, though she would never have the strength or coordination she had possessed before her illness. Her muscles had atrophied from decades of disuse, her bones had thinned, her body had aged while her mind had remained frozen. Her mind, however, was sharp and clear, untouched by the decades that her body had lived through. She remembered 1921 vividly, could describe in detail the apartment where she had lived, the garment factory where she had worked, the jazz club where she and Samuel had danced. She remembered the morning she had felt the headache beginning. She remembered feeling tired, and then nothing, no dreams, no sense of time passing, no awareness at all, simply nothing, a void, a blank space, and then waking up in a strange place with strange people telling her that she was now 60 years old. The awakening was both miraculous and tragic, a gift and a curse intertwined. Rose had to confront a world utterly transformed from the one she remembered. The flappers and jazz clubs of her youth were ancient history, things people studied in books about the past. Her friends, if they were still alive, were elderly grandmothers. Her fiancé, she learned through careful questioning, had married someone else, had lived a full life with children and grandchildren, and had passed away 5 years earlier, never knowing that Rose would wake up. The young woman who had dreamed of becoming a fashion designer, who had sketched dress designs in her spare time, now found herself an elderly woman in a body she did not recognize, in a time she did not understand, with no one left who remembered her as she had been. Dr. Sachs documented Rose's case and the cases of other patients, who awakened after decades of sleeping or being frozen in time. His book, which would later be titled Awakenings, would bring attention to the forgotten victims of the encephalitis lethargica epidemic and the remarkable, if temporary, renaissance that L-Dopa brought to their lives. For the drug's effects, as Dr. Sachs would discover, were not permanent. After months, or sometimes years of awakening, the patients began to develop tolerance to L-Dopa. Their bodies adjusted to the medication, and its effects diminished. The freezing would return, slowly at first, and then more rapidly. The sleep would reclaim them, pulling them back down into the darkness from which they had briefly emerged. Rose had approximately 2 years of wakefulness, 2 years of consciousness after 37 years of nothing. During that time, she learned about the world she had missed, tried to understand the vast changes that had occurred while she slept. She watched television and was amazed by the technology, by the idea that images could be transmitted through the air into a box in your living room. She learned about World War II, about the Holocaust, about the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. She learned about the civil rights movement, about the assassinations of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King Jr. She learned that men had walked on the moon, had traveled through space and set foot on another world. All of this seemed impossible to her, like science fiction made real, like something from the fantastic stories in pulp magazines that she had read as a young woman. She also had to grieve, and the grieving was complicated and profound. She grieved for her mother, who had devoted her entire life to caring for her sleeping daughter, who had never given up hope even when all the doctors said there was none. She grieved for Samuel and the life they might have had together, the children they might have raised, the years they might have shared. She grieved for her lost youth, for the decades that had been stolen from her, for the children she never had, for the career she never pursued, for all the experiences that make up a normal life. She grieved for all the birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that had passed without her. In many ways, awakening after so long was a form of death. The world she had known was gone completely, erased by time, and she was a stranger in this new world, an anachronism, a person out of time. Other patients awakened as well during this period, pulled back from their frozen states by the medication. An elderly man who had been frozen for 43 years suddenly began to move again, stiffly at first and then with increasing fluidity. He could walk, could speak, could engage with the world around him for the first time since he had been a young man. A woman who had been rigid and mute for decades began to sing songs from her childhood, her voice cracked with disuse, but still carrying the melodies she had learned before the illness struck. The hospital ward that had been silent and still for so long filled with the sounds of voices, of laughter, of life returning to bodies that had been empty vessels for decades. But the awakenings were fragile, delicate things that could not be sustained indefinitely. The patients began to experience side effects from the L-Dopa, complications that grew worse as the dosage was increased in an attempt to maintain the awakening. Some developed tics and involuntary movements, their bodies jerking and twitching uncontrollably. Others became manic, their minds racing, their thoughts disordered and fragmentary, unable to sleep even when exhausted. The dosage had to be carefully adjusted for each patient, a delicate balancing act, and even then, the benefits gradually diminished over time. The disease that had imprisoned them for so long still held them in its grasp. The drug could temporarily push back against it, could create a window of wakefulness, but it could not eliminate the underlying damage entirely. Rose began to slow down again in 1971, the medication gradually losing its effectiveness. Her movements became more difficult, requiring more effort and concentration. She slept for longer periods, sometimes 16 or 18 hours a day. Dr. Sachs tried adjusting her medication, increasing the dose and then decreasing it, adding other medications, but nothing seemed to help. The window of wakefulness was closing, slowly but inexorably. Rose knew what was happening. She had seen other patients fade back into their frozen states, had watched them slip away from consciousness again. She knew her time was limited, knew that the sleep was coming for her again. During her final weeks of awareness, Rose worked with Dr. Sachs to record her story, wanting to leave something behind. She wanted people to know what had happened to her, to understand what the sleeping sickness had taken from her and from thousands of others like her. She wanted people to remember the epidemic that the world had forgotten, to know that these patients had been real people with real lives before the disease struck. She spoke into Dr. Sachs's tape recorder, her voice growing weaker and more halting with each passing day, telling the story of the young seamstress who had fallen asleep in 1921 and woken up in 1969 to find that nearly 40 years had vanished. She spoke about the strangeness of losing time, of having decades stolen from her life without any awareness that they were passing. She described the sensation of awakening as though from an ordinary night's sleep, expecting it to be the next morning, only to discover that the world had moved on without her, that everyone she knew was gone or changed beyond recognition. She talked about the cruelty of the disease, which had not killed her but had suspended her in a state between life and death for most of her adult life, had stolen the best years from her. She expressed gratitude for her mother's devotion, for the woman who had never given up on her, and sorrow that she had never been able to thank her properly or say goodbye, that her mother had died still hoping for her daughter's awakening, but never seeing it. In her final recorded message, Rose addressed future generations, speaking to people she would never meet. She spoke about the importance of medical research, of not forgetting diseases just because they were no longer epidemic, just because they no longer made headlines. She urged doctors and scientists to continue trying to understand encephalitis lethargica, to learn what had caused it and why it had disappeared so mysteriously. Somewhere in that knowledge, she believed, might be insights that could help with other neurological diseases, other conditions that trapped people in their own bodies. Her suffering, she hoped, might contribute in some small way to alleviating the suffering of others in the future. Might not be entirely without meaning or purpose. Rose Mackenberg fell back into her frozen state in December of 1971, slipping away gradually over the course of several days. She slept more and more, woke less and less, until finally she did not wake at all. She lived on in the hospital for another 17 years, cared for by nurses who knew her story and treated her with tenderness and respect. She died in 1988 at the age of 90, having been unconscious or frozen for all but 2 of the 67 years since she had first fallen ill. Her death certificate listed the cause as complications of encephalitis lethargica, a disease that by then was known only to medical historians and a handful of neurologists who still puzzled over its mysteries and tried to understand what had happened during those strange years in the early 20th century. The encephalitis epidemic remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of medical history, a puzzle that has never been fully solved. Despite decades of research, despite countless studies and investigations, we still do not know what caused it. Various theories have been proposed over the years, each one seeming promising for a time before being abandoned or modified. Some researchers believe it was triggered by a virus, possibly related to the influenza virus that caused the Spanish flu pandemic that killed millions around the same time. Others suggest it might have been an autoimmune condition, the body's own immune system attacking the brain in response to an infection, mistaking healthy tissue for foreign invaders. Still others propose environmental toxins or bacterial infections as potential causes, though no definitive evidence has been found for any of these theories. What we do know with certainty is that the disease affected approximately 1 million people worldwide between 1917 and 1928, striking without warning across multiple continents. About 1/3 of patients died during the acute phase of the illness, their brains swelling beyond what their bodies could tolerate. Of those who survived, many were left with severe disabilities that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Some recovered completely, returning to their normal lives with no lasting effects. But they were in the minority, the fortunate few. The majority lived out their lives in institutions, forgotten by a world that had moved on to new concerns and new crises. Their stories untold and their suffering invisible, the sleeping sickness epidemic raises profound questions about consciousness and identity, about what it means to be a person. What does it mean to be awake? What does it mean to be alive? The patients who slept for decades were biologically alive in the most technical sense. Their hearts beat steadily, their lungs drew breath, their bodies processed food and eliminated waste. But in what sense were they present? Where did they go during those long years of sleep? Rose Mackenberg reported no dreams, no sense of time passing, no inner experience at all during her decades of unconsciousness. It was as though she had been paused, her consciousness suspended like a video on pause, waiting to be played again, existing in a state that was neither life nor death, but something in between. For the families of sleeping sickness patients, the disease created a unique kind of grief, one that had no name and no resolution. Their loved ones were neither dead nor truly alive. They could not mourn and move on, could not have closure, but they also could not maintain normal relationships, could not share experiences or make new memories together. Parents watched their children age physically while remaining mentally frozen at the age they had been when they fell ill. Their bodies growing older, but their minds unchanged. Spouses were left in a strange limbo, neither married nor widowed, neither with their partners nor without them. Life continued, but always with the ghost of the sleeping person present, a reminder of what had been lost and what might still, impossibly, be regained. The disease also challenged medical understanding of the brain and consciousness in fundamental ways. How could a person sleep for decades and then wake up with their memories and personality intact? What did this say about how the brain stores information? The fact that Rose could wake up after 37 years and remember her life in 1921 clearly suggested that memories are not dependent on continuous consciousness. They persisted somehow in her brain, preserved through all those years of sleep, waiting to be accessed again when she awakened. This was remarkable and puzzling to neuroscientists who were only beginning to understand how memory works. Dr. Oliver Sacks continued to study and write about his patients long after most of them had died, long after the brief awakenings had ended and the patients had returned to their frozen states. His book Awakenings brought their stories to a wider audience and raised important questions about medical ethics, about the nature of consciousness, and about how we define quality of life. The temporary awakenings his patients experienced with L-Dopa were both miraculous and heartbreaking. They had been given a glimpse of normal life again, a brief window of consciousness, only to have it taken away as their bodies developed tolerance to the medication. For some patients, this brief awakening was a blessing. For others, it was a cruel tease, making them aware of everything they had lost and would lose again. The survivors of the encephalitis lethargica epidemic have now all passed away. The last remnants of a forgotten tragedy. The last known survivor, a woman who had been a child when she fell ill in the 1920s, and who had lived in a chronic care facility for most of her life, died in 2006 with their deaths. Direct knowledge of the disease has been lost. We are left with medical records, with photographs of frozen patients in hospital wards, with Dr. Sax's compassionate documentation of their experiences, and with questions that may never be answered, mysteries that may never be solved. Modern neurologists occasionally see cases that resemble encephalitis, cases that remind them of the old descriptions from the 1920s. A young person will develop a mysterious illness characterized by sleep disturbances and movement problems. Tests will show inflammation in the brain. But these cases are rare, scattered, isolated incidents. Nothing like the epidemic of 1917 to 1928 has occurred again. The disease came, devastated hundreds of thousands of lives, and vanished like a ghost. Why it disappeared remains as mysterious as why it appeared in the first place. Another puzzle without a solution. Some researchers continue to investigate the sleeping sickness, driven by curiosity and the hope that understanding this old epidemic might shed light on current neurological conditions. They study preserved brain tissue from patients who died during the epidemic, looking for clues in the cellular damage. They look for genetic markers that might explain susceptibility to the disease, trying to understand why some people recovered while others remained frozen. They search for clues in historical records, trying to identify patterns that might point to a cause, whether viral, bacterial, environmental, or autoimmune. This work continues slowly, funded by small grants and pursued by dedicated researchers who believe that understanding this forgotten epidemic might yield insights into other neurological conditions. There are parallels between encephalitis, lethargica, and other diseases that we understand better today. The Parkinsonian symptoms experienced by survivors mirror those of Parkinson's disease itself, suggesting similar underlying mechanisms, similar damage to the dopamine-producing areas of the brain. The autoimmune theory of encephalitis lethargica has implications for understanding other autoimmune conditions affecting the nervous system, such as multiple sclerosis or Guillain-Barré syndrome. The long dormancy period before symptoms emerged or worsened in some patients might provide insights into other neurodegenerative diseases that seem to develop slowly over time, such as Alzheimer's disease or ALS. The sleeping sickness epidemic also serves as a reminder of how fragile our understanding of the human body remains, how much we still do not know. Despite all our advances in medical science, despite all our sophisticated imaging technology and our understanding of brain chemistry, there are still conditions that baffle us, diseases that appear and disappear without explanation. The human brain, in particular, remains largely mysterious. We have mapped its structures carefully. We understand something of its chemistry and its electrical patterns. But consciousness itself, the essence of what makes us aware and awake and present in the world, remains beyond our complete understanding. Rose Mackenberg's story reminds us to value the time we have, to appreciate the consciousness we possess, the ability to move through the world and experience life directly. For those who are frozen in time by the sleeping sickness, These ordinary abilities were precious gifts that had been taken away. When Rose awakened, she spoke of simple pleasures she had forgotten she would ever experience again. The taste of fresh bread, warm from the oven. The warmth of sunlight on her skin, filtering through a window on a spring afternoon. The sound of rain against a window, that gentle pattering rhythm. The ability to move her hand and touch another person, to feel the texture of fabric or the coolness of water. These small things, which most of us take for granted every day of our lives, were miracles to someone who had been deprived of them for decades. The epidemic also highlights the importance of caring for those who cannot care for themselves. The value of human compassion, even in seemingly hopeless situations. Rose's mother devoted her life to tending to her sleeping daughter, believing that her presence mattered even if Rose could not respond, even if there was no sign that Rose knew she was there. The nurses who cared for frozen patients in institutions often spoke of feeling that their care was important, that these patients were still people who deserved dignity and kindness, not just bodies to be maintained. In a medical system that often focuses on cure and measurable outcomes, on treating disease rather than caring for people, the sleeping sickness patients required a different kind of care, one based on hope and human compassion rather than medical intervention. There is something profoundly unsettling about the idea of being trapped in your own body, aware but unable to communicate, or of losing decades of your life to an illness that steals your consciousness without killing you. It touches on deep fears about loss of control, about the fragility of the self, about how thin the line is between being present in the world and being absent from it. The sleeping sickness survivors existed in a liminal space that challenged conventional categories of sick and well, alive and dead, present and absent. They were neither one thing nor the other, but something in between, something that our language and our understanding struggled to describe. As we move further into the 21st century, the encephalitis lethargica epidemic fades deeper into history, becoming more distant with each passing year. The hospital wards where frozen patients once lay are now closed or repurposed for other uses. The doctors and nurses who cared for them have themselves grown old and passed away, taking their memories with them. The buildings where young people like Rose Mackenberg worked and lived before falling ill have been demolished and replaced with modern structures. The physical traces of the epidemic are disappearing, erased by time and progress, but the story remains, preserved in written records and medical journals. It persists in medical journals, in Dr. Sacks's writings, in the oral histories collected from families who lost loved ones to the disease. It remains as a cautionary tale about how quickly an epidemic can emerge and how long its effects can linger, how a disease can appear suddenly and then vanish just as suddenly, leaving devastation in its wake. It remains as a testament to the resilience of human consciousness and the mysterious workings of the brain, the remarkable ability of the mind to persist even when the body fails. And it remains as a reminder of the thousands of individuals who lost their lives or their consciousness to a disease that medicine could not cure and could not explain. The woman who froze in time was not just Rose Mackenberg, though her story represents them all. She was also the thousands of other men, women, and children who fell victim to encephalitis. Each one had a story. Each one had dreams and plans, and people who loved them. Each one experienced the particular horror of having their life interrupted, of being frozen in a moment while the world moved on around them, of losing years or decades without any awareness that time was passing. Rose's story stands for all of them, a representative narrative of an epidemic that touched lives across the globe. from Vienna to New York, from London to Sydney. In the end, Rose's brief awakening in 1969 to 1971 was perhaps both a blessing and a curse, a gift and a burden. She was given the gift of consciousness again, the ability to speak and move and engage with the world after nearly 4 decades of nothingness. But she was also forced to confront everything she had lost, to experience grief for decades of stolen time, to say goodbye to a life that had ended while her body continued to live. Would it have been kinder to let her sleep on, undisturbed, unaware of what she had missed? Or was the awakening, however brief and bittersweet, valuable in itself, worth the pain it brought? These are questions without easy answers, questions that each person might answer differently. What we can say with certainty is that Rose faced her situation with remarkable grace and courage, with a dignity that impressed everyone who met her during her brief time of wakefulness. She could have been consumed by bitterness and anger at the injustice of what had happened to her, at the cruel trick that fate had played. Instead, she chose to use her brief time of awakening to tell her story, to contribute to medical knowledge, to connect with others as much as possible in the time she had. She found meaning in her suffering by trying to ensure that others might benefit from understanding what she had endured, that her experience might not be entirely without purpose. The medical community learned important lessons from the sleeping sickness survivors, lessons that continue to inform neurological research today. The trials with L-Dopa, while ultimately unable to provide permanent relief, demonstrated the brain's plasticity and its ability to respond to treatment even after decades of damage. This was remarkable and gave hope to researchers studying other chronic neurological conditions. The careful documentation of symptoms and progression helped advance understanding of brain function and neurotransmitter systems, particularly the role of dopamine in movement and consciousness. The ethical questions raised by treating patients who had been ill for so long influenced thinking about quality of life and medical intervention in ways that continue to shape medical ethics today. Today, when we encounter mysterious neurological conditions, when patients present with symptoms that don't fit neatly into known categories, the sleeping sickness epidemic serves as both inspiration and warning. It inspires us to continue searching for answers even when diseases seem inexplicable, even when the causes are not immediately apparent. It warns us not to forget those who suffer from rare or resolved epidemics, as their experiences may hold keys to understanding future conditions. It reminds us that medical knowledge is always incomplete and that humility is appropriate. When faced with the complexity of the human brain, the most complex structure we know of in the universe, the story of Rose Mackenberg and the encephalitis lethargica epidemic is ultimately a story about the human experience of illness, about what it means to be conscious and alive. It is about the nature of consciousness and time, about how we experience the passage of days and years and decades. It is about the endurance of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity, the capacity to maintain hope even in seemingly hopeless situations. It is a story about loss and grief, about watching time slip away, but also about hope and resilience, about the possibility of awakening even after decades of sleep. It is a story about the limits of medical knowledge, about how much we still don't understand, but also about the potential for unexpected recoveries and awakenings, for moments of grace in the midst of tragedy. As you prepare to sleep tonight, as you lay your head on your pillow and close your eyes, consider for a moment the miracle of ordinary consciousness. Consider the complex biological processes that allow you to be awake and aware throughout your day, to move your body at will, to experience the flow of time in a normal way, to remember the past and anticipate the future. These things that seem so natural and automatic are actually the result of intricate neurological systems that can be disrupted by disease or injury. The sleeping sickness patients lost these abilities through no fault of their own, and their loss reminds us not to take our own consciousness for granted, not to assume that the ability to be present and aware will always be with us. Sleep well tonight, knowing that your sleep is different from the sleep that claimed Rose Mackenberg and thousands like her. Your sleep is restorative and temporary, a natural part of the daily rhythm. You will wake in the morning to continue your life, to make new memories, to move forward through time in the normal way. The sleeping sickness stole that certainty from its victims. They closed their eyes, expecting to wake the next morning, expecting to continue with their plans and their lives, and instead, they vanished from the world for years or decades. Their story is one we should remember, even as we ourselves drift off into natural, healing sleep. The darkness that surrounds us when we close our eyes is not the same darkness that surrounded the sleeping. Sickness, patience. Ours is temporary and safe, a brief respite before another day begins. We trust that morning will come, that we will wake refreshed, that our consciousness will return to us as it does every morning. This trust is one of the fundamental comforts of human existence, something we rarely think about but depend on absolutely. The sleeping sickness epidemic reminds us how devastating it is when that trust is violated, when sleep becomes not rest but imprisonment, when closing your eyes means potentially losing years of your life. So rest now, secure in the knowledge that your brain will continue its necessary work while you sleep, consolidating memories, repairing cellular damage, preparing you for tomorrow. Rest knowing that your sleep is temporary and natural, part of the healthy rhythm of life, part of the cycle that sustains us. And perhaps, as you drift off, spare a thought for Rose Mackenberg and all those who were not so fortunate, who closed their eyes and did not wake for years, who lost vast portions of their lives to a mysterious illness that medicine could not cure. Their story has been told, their suffering has been remembered, and now you can sleep peacefully, grateful for the simple gift of ordinary consciousness and the reliable cycle of sleeping and waking that carries us through our days. The room grows quiet now. The day's activities fade away. Your body relaxes into the mattress. Your breathing slows and deepens naturally. This is ordinary sleep, the kind that has sustained human beings since the beginning of time. It is not the sleep that took Rose away for decades. It is simply rest, simple and necessary and temporary. Tomorrow you will wake, and the world will be there waiting for you, just as you left it. This is the normal way of things, the way it should be. Think of Rose's mother, sitting beside that bed for years, holding her daughter's hand, never giving up hope. Think of the devotion that sustained her through all those years of waiting, through all the days that blurred together, through all the mornings when Rose's eyes remained closed. That kind of love is remarkable. That kind of dedication is extraordinary. It reminds us of what people are capable of when they love someone deeply, when they refuse to abandon hope, even when hope seems foolish. Think of Samuel, the baker, who visited every evening after work, still dusted with flour, telling Rose about his day even though she could not hear him, even though she gave no sign that she was aware of his presence. He spoke to her as though she could understand every word, as though their connection remained unbroken. Eventually, he had to move on with his life. had to release his grip on a future that would never arrive, but he never forgot her completely. Somewhere in his heart, she remained the young woman he had loved, the woman who had promised to marry him. The hospital ward where Rose eventually lived was quiet most of the time, filled with patients who made no sound. The nurses moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, turning bodies to prevent sores, administering medications through tubes. It was repetitive work, demanding work, work that required both physical strength and emotional resilience. These nurses cared for patients who would never thank them, who would never acknowledge their efforts, who existed in a state beyond ordinary human interaction. Yet they continued their work with compassion and dedication. Dr. Sachs brought something different to that ward. He brought curiosity and hope and the willingness to see his patients as complete human beings rather than medical cases. He spent time with them, observing them carefully, noting small details that others might have missed. He saw the tiny movements, the slight responses to stimuli, the evidence that something remained alive inside these frozen bodies. His careful observation led him to try L-Dopa, to give these forgotten patients one more chance at waking life. The awakening, when it came, was gradual for most patients. They did not suddenly sit up and speak clearly. Instead, they emerged slowly, like swimmers rising from deep water. First a flutter of the eyelids, then the eyes opening briefly before closing again, then longer periods of wakefulness, then the first attempts at speech, words formed slowly and with great effort. Then movement, stiff and awkward at first, muscles remembering slowly how to function. It was a process, a journey from frozen to fluid, from silent to speaking. For Rose, those 2 years of wakefulness must have been overwhelming. Imagine waking up to discover that everyone you knew was dead or elderly. Imagine looking in a mirror and seeing an old woman's face looking back at you when you still felt 23 inside. Imagine learning that the world had been through a Second World War, that atomic weapons existed, that humans had walked on the moon. The sheer amount of change would be staggering, almost impossible to process. She had to learn how to live in this new world, had to understand new social customs and new technologies. Television alone must have seemed like magic to someone who remembered the 1920s. The idea that you could sit in your room and watch events happening far away, that images could be transmitted through the air, would have been the stuff of science fiction when Rose fell asleep. Now it was ordinary reality, something everyone took for granted. The other patients who awakened had similar experiences of disorientation and wonder. An elderly man who had been frozen since his 20s woke to find himself with white hair and wrinkled hands. He looked at his reflection with shock, unable to recognize himself. A woman who had been frozen as a young mother woke to learn that her children were now middle-aged adults with children of their own. She had missed their entire lives, had not seen them grow up, had not been there for any of the important moments. Some of the awakenings were more successful than others. Some patients regained significant function and were able to engage meaningfully with the world around them. Others remained severely disabled even when awake, able to be conscious but unable to move or speak effectively. For them, waking was perhaps even crueler than sleeping. At least in sleep, they had been unaware. Now they were aware but still trapped, able to see the world but unable to participate in it fully. The side effects of L-Dopa were challenging to manage. Some patients became hyperactive, unable to sit still, their bodies moving constantly in repetitive patterns. Others developed hallucinations, seeing things that weren't there, experiencing reality in distorted ways. The medication that brought them back to life also brought new problems, new difficulties to navigate. Dr. Sachs had to constantly adjust dosages, trying to find the right balance for each patient, trying to maximize the benefits while minimizing the harmful effects. As the months passed, the awakenings began to fade. The patients started to slow down again, to sleep more, to move less. Their bodies were developing tolerance to the medication, requiring higher and higher doses to maintain the same effect. But higher doses brought more severe side effects. It was a losing battle. Dr. Sachs knew it, the nurses knew it, and most poignantly, the patients themselves knew it. They could feel themselves slipping back toward the frozen state, could feel the window of consciousness closing gradually. Rose spent her final weeks of wakefulness, recording her memories and her thoughts. She wanted to leave something behind, wanted her experience to be documented and remembered. She spoke about what it felt like to lose so much time, to have decades erased from your life. She spoke about the strangeness of being out of sync with time, of feeling young inside an old body, of remembering a world that no longer existed. She spoke about grief and loss, but also about gratitude for the chance to wake up at all. Even briefly, her voice on those recordings is weak but clear, thoughtful and articulate. She chose her words carefully, wanting to express things that were difficult to put into language. How do you explain what it feels like to be frozen in time? How do you describe the experience of waking up decades later? She did her best, speaking slowly, pausing often to gather her thoughts, creating a record that would outlast her final return to sleep when Rose fell back into her frozen state in December of 1971. It was not sudden. She gradually slept more and more each day, woke less and less, until finally she did not wake at all. The nurses noted the change in her chart. Dr. Sachs observed her decline with sadness, and then she was gone again, back to that place beyond consciousness where she had spent most of her life. She would remain there for 17 more years before her body finally gave up entirely. The hospital where Rose spent her final years continued to house other encephalitis lethargica survivors, but their numbers dwindled over time. One by one they died, these forgotten victims of an epidemic that the world had long since stopped thinking about. The ward grew quieter. Beds that had been occupied for decades were finally emptied. The era of the sleeping sickness was ending. Not with any dramatic conclusion, but simply through the passage of time and the inevitable march of mortality. Dr. Sachs continued his work with other patients, studying other neurological conditions, writing about the strange and wonderful ways that brains can malfunction and sometimes recover. But he never forgot his encephalitis lethargica patients, never forgot the brief time when they had awakened. He wrote about them with compassion and insight, treating them not as medical curiosities, but as complete human beings whose experiences had profound meaning. His book, Awakenings, became a classic, read by medical students and general readers alike, keeping the memory of these patients alive. The medical mystery of what caused encephalitis lethargica remains unsolved. Modern researchers, using advanced techniques, have studied preserved tissue samples from patients who died during the epidemic. They have found evidence of inflammation and immune system activation, but the specific trigger remains elusive. Was it a virus that we have never identified? Was it an autoimmune response to a common infection? Was it something environmental that appeared briefly and then vanished? We simply do not know. Some researchers have suggested that encephalitis lethargica might not have been a single disease, but rather a syndrome with multiple possible causes. Perhaps different infectious agents or environmental factors could produce similar symptoms. This would explain why the disease appeared and disappeared so mysteriously, why it has never returned in epidemic form. But this is speculation, not proven fact. The truth remains hidden, buried in the past. What we can say with certainty is that encephalitis lethargica was real and devastating. It affected approximately 1 million people worldwide, killing about a third of them and leaving the majority of survivors with significant disabilities. It destroyed families, ended careers, stole decades of life from people who had done nothing to deserve such a fate. It was a tragedy on a massive scale, and yet it has been largely forgotten except by medical historians and a small number of researchers who continue to study it. The forgetting itself is instructive. We remember the Spanish flu, which killed millions. We remember polio, which paralyzed thousands of children. But we have forgotten encephalitis lethargica, even though it was equally devastating to those it affected. Perhaps this is because the sleeping sickness left its victims alive, but not fully present, existing in a liminal state that made them easy to overlook. Dead people are mourned and remembered, but people who are neither dead nor truly alive can be forgotten, hidden away in institutions, erased from public consciousness. Rose's story brings them back into the light, gives them voice and presence. Through her we can understand something of what they experienced, what they suffered, what they lost. Her 2 years of wakefulness gave her the chance to tell her story, to make her experience known. In doing so, she spoke for all the others who never got that chance, who slipped into sleep and never emerged again, whose stories died with them unrecorded and unremembered. The night deepens now. The world grows quiet. This is the time when the boundary between waking and sleeping becomes thin, when consciousness begins to fade naturally. For most of us, this transition happens smoothly, automatically, without any conscious effort. We simply let go and drift away, trusting that we will return in the morning. But for Rose and the others, that trust was betrayed. They let go and did not return, or returned only after decades had passed, or returned only briefly before being pulled back down into the darkness. Think now of ordinary sleep, how it feels to be drowsy, to feel your thoughts becoming less focused, your body relaxing completely. This is natural and good. This is how sleep should be. Not the pathological sleep of encephalitis lethargica, but the restorative sleep that healthy bodies need. Not the frozen immobility of catatonia, but the relaxed stillness of normal rest. Not the decades-long absence from consciousness, but the brief nightly pause that refreshes and renews. Your eyelids are heavy now, perhaps. Your breathing has slowed. Your muscles have released their tension. This is the body's natural preparation for sleep, the gradual shutting down of systems that can rest while others continue their essential work. Your heart will keep beating. Your lungs will keep breathing. Your brain will continue processing and consolidating, doing the necessary work of maintenance and organization. But your consciousness can rest, can step back, can take a break from the effort of being awake and aware. Rose would have given anything to experience this kind of ordinary sleep during those years. When she was trapped in frozen immobility, she would have welcomed the simple experience of lying down tired at night and waking refreshed in the morning. But that simple gift was denied to her, stolen by a disease that medicine could not understand or treat. Her experience reminds us not to take for granted the ordinary miracles of daily life, the simple functions that we depend on but rarely notice. The story of the sleeping sickness is a sad one. full of loss and grief and unanswered questions. But it is also, in some ways, a hopeful story. It shows us that consciousness is remarkably resilient, that people can wake up even after decades of being frozen, that the essential self persists even when expression is impossible. It shows us that medical science, while limited, can sometimes achieve unexpected breakthroughs. It shows us that human compassion and dedication can persist even in seemingly hopeless situations. That people like Rose's mother will continue to care even when there is no reasonable expectation of recovery. The world has moved on from the encephalitis lethargica epidemic. New diseases have emerged. New crises have demanded attention. The specific tragedy of the sleeping sickness has faded into history, but the lessons remain relevant. We still encounter mysterious illnesses. We still struggle to understand the brain. We still face situations where medicine reaches its limits. And we still need the kind of dedication and compassion that Rose's mother showed, the kind of curiosity and hope that Dr. Sachs embodied. Rest now in the knowledge that you are not Rose, not frozen in time, not trapped between sleeping and waking. You are simply a person lying down to sleep at the end of another day. Tomorrow will come. You will wake. Life will continue. This is the natural order, the way things should be, the rhythm that sustains us all. Sleep is meant to be temporary and restorative, a gift rather than a prison. The darkness is gentle now. The world is quiet. Your thoughts are drifting, becoming less focused, less urgent. This is good. This is right. This is how sleep begins, naturally and easily, without struggle or resistance. Let it come. Trust the process. Your body knows what to do. Your brain knows how to slip from waking into sleeping, from conscious awareness into the deeper rest that renews and restores. Rose's story has been told. Her suffering has been witnessed and remembered. The sleeping sickness epidemic has been documented and studied. The lessons have been learned as much as they can be. And now, finally, you can rest, secure in the knowledge that your sleep will be ordinary and temporary, that you will wake when you are ready, that consciousness will return to you naturally and automatically, as it always has and always will. Sleep now. Sleep peacefully. Sleep knowing that you are safe, that your sleep is natural, that morning will come. Sleep.